nice to see everybody that's tuned in right now. Thank you for joining me. I'm excited to share with you a Transformationalist guide to saving the future. And you are joining me in a beautiful, sunny, and already very hot Orlando, Florida. Thank you so much for our host in Barcelona and in Spain. We're very appreciative. And so I'll be sharing today, and actually my business partner in crime, Yvette Montero Salatico, will be on tomorrow as well. So you can sort of catch the whole plethora of us. So I'm going to jump in to our presentation today, the Transformationalist Guide to Saving the Future. And just a quick sort of thought here that at Kedge, and she'll be talking a little bit more about the Future School tomorrow, but you'll hear me mention it today too. The Future School is our learning ecosystem of our consultancy, Kedge. We're a global foresight, innovation, and strategic design firm with a learning ecosystem. And we tend to gravitate towards transformational change. As good futurists, it's very, very important for us to look across a plethora of alternative futures, from most likely to least likely, from transformative to dystopic, and everything in between. And as many have probably already said before me today, there's only so many futures that we can actually model or look at, so we need to look across that cone of possibilities of futures. Nonetheless, we all know that we want to aim for transformational or aspirational goals and outcomes. We want to be able to create the future. It's one of the reasons that our motto is discover the future and create it today. The truth of the matter is that we're all thinking about the future, whether consciously or unconsciously. And the way that we think about the future directly impacts the actions that we take today. And we know we want to take actions today that are transformational, that lead us to better futures, the futures for all of humanity. And so what I'm going to be talking about today is really how to get out of the bubble or out of the status quo of those used or those even retro or dominant narratives, retro futures or used futures that often keep us stuck and going in circles. Even many times we practice foresight work with these sort of dominant narratives in mind. We build scenarios that still have those dominant narratives in mind. That doesn't mean it's completely wrong, and there's a lot of value to that. But at the same time, as futurist Yoki Tuomi says, we need to think less plausible, less possible, and more constructivist today. And so how do we really get at those futures that we don't feel like we saw coming? I know a lot of my previous comrades here and partners in arms speaking today have already talked about whether or not this pandemic was a black swan or was it a gray rhino or what was it really? But no matter what you think it was, how do we look past those dominant narratives that really tend to block us and blind us? So, you know, we've seen tons of books, and if you look on Amazon or Google and just look up the title, How to Think Like a Futurist, you will find a ton of great books on how to think like a futurist. And the reason these are written is because many, many, many futurists, if not all of them, know that it's so important that we all think this way. We really believe, and I know that many of our associates around the world believe as well, that if everybody thought like a futurist, what that really means, then the world would be a better place. And it's not that we would avoid viruses or avoid climate change altogether, but we would definitely go beyond just mitigating them to really being able to understand how to enact new change, systemic change, but also metaphorical change and change that's deep-seated across culture, across society, across humanity that would really make a difference long before those events came about. You'll see here, you know, people like Marina Gorbis from IFTF or Cicely Summers, who I think is on later. Maybe she was on earlier today. I've lost sense of time because of the pandemic. And many others like Amy Webb, who have all written articles or books about how to think like a futurist. But how exactly do we go about doing that? How do we really think like a futurist? Well, you will be able to find me on Medium as well if you want to read some of my articles. I wrote an article recently called A Transformationalist Guide to Saving the Future, and it takes a little bit different turn than what I'm going to be sharing today. But I also wrote an article about a year and a half ago. Well, I guess it was almost 2 years ago now, because I see the date here. I lose track of time again. It's time to democratize the future. So we always say that our mission and goal is to democratize the future, but also to democratize foresight. And I think those are slightly different. The first, democratize the future, really means getting as many people, if not everybody in the world, to think like a futurist, to think this way, to be able to think beyond the dominant narratives and the systems that we are presently in, and to see what is unfolding, what is emerging, what is beckoning to come to pass. And how do we navigate the badlands, so to speak? How do we mitigate change and all of those good things, as you've already heard? So it is time to democratize the future. But how do we do that? We do it by democratizing foresight, which is the thinking, the philosophy, the methodologies, and the tools, et cetera, that allow people or empower people or give agency to people to actually democratize the future. So it's not just enough to brainstorm about the future. We need to say that this is a purposeful and intentional way of looking at the future, and there's methodologies around it, there's ways to do it. We need to be able to take it to people that aren't just as foresight programs or PhD programs around the world. We can't have this holy huddle of futurists. Everybody in the world needs to think like a futurist. We need to flatten the curve, so to speak, with futures, not just with coronavirus. So it's time to democratize the future, but let's look a little bit deeper at what that really means. So I know you're all thinking right now, oh no, a Minority Report slide. Are you kidding me? So can you believe how old this movie is already? It seems like it was just made not long ago, but it's well over 20 years old already. And Minority Report, had this part in it where the precogs, they could see pre-crime, and there was 3 of them, and they float in a pool. And that's not what thinking like a futurist is, and that's not what futurists do. But actually, though, there is a beautiful metaphor in this movie. And that beautiful metaphor that is locked inside this movie really has to do with what is futures thinking really? How do we really practice the technology, the technological mindset, or that technology, mental technology, futures thinking, and how do we really get it out to the world? So even though we're not going to be creating precogs and everybody's not going to be floating in the water to be able to understand how the future unfolds, there is a beautiful metaphor here, and let's really explore what that means. So a lot of times, I'm really excited to see this, by the way. 20 years ago, I've been practicing in the field for a long time. I was just saying over and over again, I cannot wait for the design community and the futures community to really come together and to meld together. And we are seeing that happen more and more. As a matter of fact, I think tomorrow, Phil Balagdis, who runs Primer Conference and Design Futures Initiatives, is going to be speaking. And there's a whole conference on speculative foresight, design fiction, design futures. So even though I'm not speaking about that today, it is a great arena for us to practice foresight in, besides innovation, strategy, organizational development, social innovation, et cetera, et cetera. So there was this article, sometime back that said design thinking needs to think bigger. And let me just modify this because somebody was saying that they could not see the slides. So I'm not 100% sure what's going on there. Oh, I'm so sorry about that. So thank you for telling me that. I'm just talking, which is perfectly fine. But somebody just realized, oh my gosh, he's not sharing the slides. So hopefully you can see them now. And just let me know if you can. So there was this article in Fast Company magazine that said design thinking needs to think much bigger. The reason I love this article is because it really talks about us living in a very complex world. As a matter of fact, I'm just going to read the quote from it here. It says, "We live in a massively complex, intricately interconnected global system, and it's increasingly impossible to be designers or human beings or in strategy or in innovation, etc., without taking into account how we affect and are in turn affected by all the moving pieces of the organic machine." Here comes the most important part. The more complex an organism is, this is going to shock some of you maybe, the more capable it actually becomes. And the more capable it is, the more we're able to address challenges and seize opportunities. Wait, let me reiterate what was just said there. The more complex something is, the more capable it is, the more complex it is, the more we can solve problems and seize opportunities. How many times have you read in Strategy Business, Harvard Business Review, or some magazine, we need to kill complexity, we need to stomp complexity, or we need to at least simplify complexity? And what the author of this article is saying, and you're about to see many other smart people are saying today, more than ever before, the voices are getting louder, is complexity is not your enemy. Complexity did not cause this. There's another C word that does cause this, and that is complication. And that's what we do to systems to stop complexity from overriding us, because we don't want to change. We want to keep the status quo. Complexity actually gives us a larger landscape on which to paint or to create. Complexity is the matrix of creativity. And we have gotten drilled into our brains that complexity is the enemy. And we have read about complexity and we study complexity, but we keep overlaying this metaphor of the enemy on complexity when complexity is actually the natural order of the universe. I'm going to oversimplify here, but if I look out into the universe and I see, and I'm looking out, I'm one of the early explorers and I've got a telescope and I look out there, do things get more complex or simple? They get more complex, right? And if I'm looking into the micro world in a microscope, things don't get more simple, they get more complex. The complexity is a sign of maturity, it's a sign of growth, it's the natural order of the universe. So we've got to create a new story around complexity if we're going to be good futures thinkers. As a matter of fact, I'll go so far as to say complexity science, the study of complexity and foresight are twins, they're sisters, they're kissing cousins, they go together. And so futures thinkers are really people who are diving into complexity. There's a lot more for us to say about this though. And I want to go to Dunn and Raby, who echoed the same thing, used to teach at Parsons. And they said, what if we're completely educating wrong? Not just in design, I would say, I'd go a little bit further, but in all of our education. What if teaching designers or teaching students, period, to frame every issue, no matter how complex, as a problem to be solved, squanders valuable creative and imaginative energy on the unachievable? What if design, and I would just say education period's focus on making stuff real, perpetuates everything that's wrong with current reality, ensuring that all possible futures are merely extrapolations of our dysfunctional present? So what this is saying to us is that as future thinkers, we have to look beyond the reality we now know. As Jonas Salk wrote in a book many years ago, 1973, I believe, he wrote a book called A New Reality. And he talked about demographics and flattening the curve of population growth, and that things would change and we would enter this new reality. It's been going on for a long time. People have been saying it, and we still haven't changed those systems. And we need to do that today. So I love to often quote Fritjof Capra, a famous physicist. And he says very similar in his new book, A Systems View of Life. He says basically that we've discovered that the material world ultimately is a network of inseparable patterns of relationships. Evolution is no longer seen as a competitive struggle. We got to get away from that narrative as well. Competitive struggle for existence, but rather a cooperative dance, cooperation, collaboration, convergence, in which creativity and constant emergence of novelty are the driving forces. And with this new emphasis on complexity, as Bill Gates said, the 21st century will be considered the century of understanding complexity and dancing with it. Networks, patterns of organization, a new science of qualities is slowly emerging. I would say it's not slowly emerging. I would say it's already been here for a while. It's called foresight. And so I would take it one step further and say all of you who are concerned with foresight are actually in this qualities, science of qualities now. Another one of my favorite writers, Daniel Christian Wallace, says a very similar thing. To think like a futurist means to embrace complexity. And he actually goes on to talk about 4 different ways of looking at complexity science, but the complexity science actually facilitates the emergence of positive or desirable properties, emerging through the qualities of relationships within the system and the quality of information that flows through that system. Again, complexity is not your enemy, it's complication. That's what we do to complexity to actually try to stop it from taking away the systems that we love so much. Now we're in a time where we have a decision to make, aren't we? So he ends by saying, the practice of foresight and anticipation strengthens our awareness of potential future states. I know Rial Miller spoke earlier this morning, but a lot of what I'm saying probably harkens you back to the idea of futures literacy and futures literacy labs and the work that Rial does with the United Nations. So we need to really embrace complexity, he says, and able to be futures literate or to use the future. As a matter of fact, this quote here at the bottom says, a futures literate person is better able to detect and attribute meaning to novelty, new things, new futures, and complex emergence than someone who is futures illiterate. Becoming futures literate, becoming a futures thinker, democratizing the future can enhance human efforts to sense and make sense of complexity. So we can no longer attempt to manage complexity by simplifying. Foresight is not a tool, in my opinion, for you to try to simplify things or get them down to the lowest common denominator. It's rather dancing with complexity and being able to use those landscapes of complexity to inform new realities, novelty, futures literacy, an understanding of what's newly unfolding. Now we must harness and leverage complexity for solutions and new opportunities. It's a harnessing and a leveraging of complexity. As a matter of fact, the trajectory of evolution itself moves from simplicity to complexity. We could say from competition to cooperation, from what is old to what is new, from quantitative to qualitative. And so we need to be much more in tune with qualitative measurements, or as Fritjof Capra says, a science of qualities. And so we see here that greater diversification leads to greater maturity, greater complexity, and a higher level of systemic complexity that allows us to see what's emerging. So the last part of my presentation here, I've got another 15 minutes, and then I'll turn over to Q&A, is I want to look at, even though I don't believe for a moment, and I know a lot of you probably don't either, that things are linear and move across a linear system, let's just, for the sake of understanding here, model this idea about a transformationalist mindset across a spectrum. And you'll see the spectrum occurring over and over in the rest of my presentation. So first of all, I just want to orient you to the push and the pull of the future. The future exists across a spectrum, from the push to the pull. So in the push of the future, we're seeing those trends. By the way, trends aren't the future. Trends are the present. The reason you know that is because you know about them. They're here today. So trends can be your worst enemy, because when you fixate on the trend, it can block you from seeing what's trying to emerge in the horizons past that trend. Now, trends do help us because they give us insight into direction and speed, but they also help us because when we know in reality, trends don't exist in isolation, they collide together, they form emerging ideas towards the pull of the future. So the push in, trends are pushing us, and they're making us do things that we might not want to do, and then we try to complicate to hang on to the status quo, but they push us whether we want to be pushed or not. On the pull end of the future, we actually can use futures literacy, a transformationalist change mindset, complexity, and emergence to pull ourselves to the future. As a matter of fact, the name of our firm, Kedge, some may know, is a smaller anchor on a sailing vessel. When there was no wind at sea and the large sailing vessels, the giant sails did them no good, and you were going stir crazy out at sea, you actually had this kedge. It still exists today. And they would tie that smaller anchor, not the big anchor, not the one that you drop and the boat goes nowhere. That would be a terrible name for a futures firm. The anchor that helps us go nowhere. The smaller anchor, the kedge, they would tie to a very long rope that they kept in the bottom of the boat. They would put that kedge in a rowboat, and they would put the newer sailors into the rowboat, and they would row out in the direction they wanted to go, maybe a mile out. They would drop that kedge in the water, and everybody left on the ship would pull and pull themselves to where they wanted to go. That's the pull of the future. After 20 years of doing this work, I can tell you that when you practice robust and rigorous foresight, you not only pull yourself to the future, but you can pull the future to today. Because as you start to pull, the future manifests itself emergently. That's what complexity does. It emerges in front of us, the patterns of emergence. Patterns, which are collisions of trends, by the way, is emerging landscapes of change. So I want you to keep in mind the push and pull of the future as we look at that same spectrum, that same timeline in different ways. So first of all, what does it mean to move from epistemic uncertainty to ontological unpredictability? Think about the push and pull. So on the push in, we have epistemic uncertainty. It's a fat term that simply means that if I just get more knowledge, that's what foresight's about. If I can just get me more knowledge, more data about the future, then I will know what future is trying to unfold, or I can start to make maps around the future, or scenarios around the future. And it's really looking at the future from that push in. A lack of data is all I have. I have measurement errors, or there's hidden variables I just haven't found yet. It's a mechanical and quantitative and past-oriented and colonized way of looking at the future. It's like saying to ourselves, our knowledge about the world is just limited. If I can make it less limited, I'll be a good futurist. So I'm not discounting that in completely. There's stuff there, there's good stuff there. But in the world today that we live in, the nature of the future itself is changing. The future is not changing only. The nature of the future is changing. The way things change is changing. The manner in which they change is changing. So foresight that we did 20 years ago won't take us into the future. We need to update the field. By the way, if there's any field that should continually be updating itself, it should be the foresight field. We should not be stuck in 50 years ago. But we need to continually update, right? And that's what ontological is. Ontology, the nature of something. Unpredictability, not seen because we haven't seen it before. It hasn't existed before. So you're saying to yourself probably right now, well, that makes foresight impossible. All we have is data, but that's not true. Because good foresight allows us to think outside of our assumptions and biases, our guiding narratives, our dominant narratives, and get past those to a constructivist view of foresight. This is really where creative evolution comes in, transformative invention. This is organic, qualitative, alternative futures, and a decolonized way of looking at the world. As a matter of fact, it's like saying the world itself is a process. Evolution and breakpoints invent new categorical realities. On the other side of this pandemic we're in, many people are already saying, how do we get to new realities? How do we change the system? And you won't change it from within the system. You'll change it by understanding foresight from an emergent point of view, from a futures literacy point of view, from a transformationalist change point of view. I just stuck this side in because a lot of what I just said about epistemic uncertainty versus ontological unpredictability comes again from the futurist Yoko Tuomi, who says you can only count cows after the cows exist. And what he meant by that is that if you go back to the beginning of animal husbandry, there were 80 plus species of cattle, bull, oxen that we have bred over time to be milking cows. Nobody stood back there hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years ago and said, I know it's gonna be a milking cow, we're gonna have dairy farms. They bred them continuously until we got to what we have today. So if the only way that you can see a cow or count a cow is after that cow exists, then how do we know what's going to be relevant as the nature of the future unfolds? And there are ways that we can actually approach this. As Rial Miller again says in the Futures Literacy Labs at the UN, we have to move from, again, the push, anticipation for the future, to the pull, anticipation for emergence. They are different. One is trend scanning, scouting, preparation, planning processes. I'm not delegitimizing that altogether. That's a part of the process. But we also, and more, have to think about anticipation for emergence, which is novelty perception. Becoming more futures literate can enhance human efforts to sense and make sense of complexity, as I had already read to you before. It's very important for us to understand. So I'm basically going to end my presentation today. I've got about 7 minutes left here, with showing you something that I show and when I speak at design and strategy and innovation conferences, et cetera, around the world. And this is how we can look at futures and how we can start to approach this. And there's so much more for me to say about this today, actual methods to use. I'm not getting into that much today, but I'm going to give you some places that you can go to look at those. One is my article on Medium that I just wrote, A Transformationalist Guide to the Future, where we actually share a proprietary tool that we use a lot at KEDGE to help people to think and actually work this way within organizations around the world. We've worked in organizations globally and have used those kinds of tools. So in our inner circle, again, sort of like the push end of the future, we think of the future as being a time. And this is really a probable way of looking at the future. The future is reductively determined by the past. We need more data. I'm just going to look at what just happened. I'm going to extrapolate. Future is a time, and I'm going to say what will happen in 5 years, 10 years, 20 years from now. And I'm really thinking of it in terms of time. It's a very dangerous thing for us to do as futurists, or to teach futurists thinking this way or foresight this way within organizations, because the moment a pandemic arises or something else less scary, like the Tuesday afternoon meeting at 4 o'clock to plan for next week's launch, everybody's going to ignore that time. The time that's going to be important is going to be the now, the very now, and not that long now. So it's very important that we get past time, which binds us to a reductive way of looking at the future. So that next space out as we move down our spectrum of the future is the future as a place or a space. And my good friend Sohail Inyatola often talks about this, the future being a place or a space. When we get past time and see the future as a space that we are going to live in, are there trees there? Are there rivers there? Are there planets there? How do people work, or do they work? Is work even a thing? Have we redefined what that means? What's the mode of transportation? Have we gotten past transportation and mobility and all of that? We can really use scenario and futures thinking as an ethnographic and anthropological tool to investigate the future, and we suspend disbelief, transport people to the future into a space past time. And this is where we see alternative futures and possibilities. The future is recursively expressed as shared dominant beliefs about the present. Now, it sounds like I was saying a bunch of good things, and then I hit you with that sentence that says it's these dominant beliefs that keep reinforcing. Because how many times have you ever built a scenario or read scenarios that you want to make sure that you don't lose your readers, so they have to have connection to monuments and things they can understand and things that they'll recognize, monuments they'll recognize. So I certainly believe that. But we write a lot of our scenarios, we do a lot of our scenario work from a place of those dominant narratives, those guiding narratives that are already in our head, those official futures. And so even when we make these amazing scenarios that are often very helpful about alternative possibilities, they are still created out of those dominant narratives, those guiding narratives that are already in our mind. This is another reason why, by the way, assumption and bias work, our unconscious futures modeling is so important in futures work. So you see another space out here. So the future is a time, but it's helpful to go past time to really think about the nature of the future changing and build ontological unpredictability and not just epistemological uncertainty. And the future is a place, and that's good, and we do good work around that, but we have to get past that as well if we're going to understand the nature of the future is changing. Then what is that third space? And as I said earlier, and you'll be able to see this, I assume in the slides, the recent release of that kind of thing, that when we only think of the future as time and space or space-time, then we're thinking from an inside-out perspective. We gravitate back to simplicity. We try to defeat complexity. We think more centralized, linear, siloed, enclosed systems. We say the future is defined by space-time or time and space, and therefore our present-day decisions are constricted by time and space. So there's a third space. And that third space is the future is an encounter or an experience. And this is a place where, we're really able to say to ourselves that the future is about complexity, it's about emergence. It's an outside-in view, it's a decentralized view. It's a spiral, emergent, post-transdisciplinary, open system view of the future. Because if you can experience the future internally, the poet Rainer Rilke said, the future first enters into us before it expresses itself through us to manifest itself to the world. Basically, I'm paraphrasing. That wasn't quite it, but it was close. Horseshoes and hand grenades. And so the future can be experienced outside of time and space. It can, because it can be experienced first internally. As a matter of fact, today, the good futures work that needs to be done, this transformational change, is not going to be done by approaching the systems that already exist. We have to think of new systems, new ways to think of healthcare, new wellness systems, new ways to think of government, new ways to think of economics, new ways to think of equity and broad-based prosperity and social development, and ways that our organizations can change to be healthy and prosperous, and that everybody can be a futures thinker and everybody gets to participate, right? So the future can be experienced outside of time, space, or space-time, or using time and space as a surrogate, if you think about it, and our present day decisions are not constructed or constricted by time and space. So I think that largely that's going to wrap up. Yeah, we're super close. I want to leave time for Q&A, and we're right at time. So is it possible to intentionally cultivate foresight as a collective, social, evolutionary human trait? I'm taking one step further now. But if some of you were following me, you were like, wonder if Frank has ever thought about the fact that he tends to be hinting at the fact that foresight itself is evolutionary, or an evolutionary trait that should be emerging. If we've always depended on a flight and fright, or fight and flight, then could it be that that's the push in, and the pull in is really futures thinking and futures literacy, and it's not just a skill that we can teach and should teach to everyone, it's actually something that we should purposely and intentionally, through intentional evolution, be promoting as a collective social evolutionary human trait. So I believe the answer is a resounding yes. I don't have time to go into all of that today, but I've given you just enough to wet your whistle. But I promise that there's a way to find out more about this. So it's going to require that we all, every one of us, not just people who consider themselves to be futures today, but you need to get out there and start democratizing future with every single person you meet. We need to have it in K through 12. We need to have it in our college courses. We need to have it in organizations. We need to have it in the public square, because we have to practice with a new paradigm of governance, organizational development, and social dynamics. So if you want to see that second part of this presentation, which is really about the evolutionary aspect of foresight and how foresight is more than just a practice or a discipline, but it's actually an evolutionary trait that we can intentionally and purposely move forward, that through consciousness, we become the process ourselves. Then you can look at the Futures School blog, the Futures School, 2 S's in the middle there, futuresschool.com. And you can go to our blog and read all about holoptic foresight dynamics, which is a theory and idea that we've worked on for over 10 years that really helps you to understand this. So be happy for you guys to go there and take a look at that. Also, I wanted to let you know that if you really think this was cool, what I shared today, and please tune in for Yvette tomorrow. I think she's at 4 p.m. tomorrow, 4 p.m. New York time. She's going to talk about the natural foresight framework and really how that we can implement foresight. I sort of took you at a high level today, and I get excited about this because I get jazzed about these ideas. She's going to share with you some very exciting but practical ways to apply this. And one of the ways you can is through attending our Applied Foresight Activator, which is a live, online, 6-month, which started before our pandemic that we're in right now, but we're so happy that it did, because now we're going to start our second cohort in June, and registration is open for that live online, 6 months, 2 times a month, 90-minute sessions live with people from around the world. We use a multitude of different platforms to do all kinds of work, hands-on work. We get our hands dirty in the lab and learn foresight tools and the way to think like I talked about today. So this is where I'm going to stop. Just about right on time, and I've got another 30 or 25 minutes left and time for some Q&A. So let's see here. Cool, I was looking at some of the chat stuff here. Everybody always says, love your passion and energy, which means that I'm just super hyper. It's awesome. Let's see, how do I get to the questions? Q&A, I see it here, great. So. All right, going to back up a little bit. What is the difference between complexity thinking and systems thinking, Simone said? That is a great question. And I love that Sohail is still going to be speaking because, of course, at some point he'll be talking about, diving below complexity and thinking about, values, social systems, worldviews, metaphors, myths, and metaphors. So systems thinking, of course, obviously is a very important part of futures thinking. But if we only get stuck at the systems level, and again, it is important, I'm not dismissing it, but if we get stuck at the systems level, we get stuck in that level where we think we can move nodes and pieces of the system around and not really understand that the metaphor is what's really driving the outcome of what systems takes place. Different organizations, different nations, different families, different structures have different systems. Why? Because they have different values and different myths and metaphors that underlie those. Really, when we even think about the way that this all started, the present crisis that we're in, it's really not a system-driven problem, it's a metaphor-driven problem. And so that doesn't mean metaphors are going to change overnight. When I say myth and metaphor, I don't mean it's not real. I mean the way that we see the world in different countries, in different organizations, maybe even individually. And it's different from the way somebody else sees the world. And our metaphors drive the systems that we will choose and the way that we'll manipulate the system. So obviously metaphors and myths can be learned. We have systems in place that are struggling and fighting back right now and keeping us from really advancing. And that's driven by metaphors about how the world works. So the reason the complexity is different from just systems thinking is complexity operates across not just the levels of systems, but across metaphors, communication, et cetera, et cetera. As a matter of fact, when we think about complex adaptive systems, the natural foresight framework that we use is built on complex adaptive systems, but also complex responsive processes, which is a more human system way of looking at it, not a systems way. And then complex potential states, which really talks about moving beyond complex adaptive systems and panarchies to really understanding those potential states that are hovering in the background, but later could be a giant driver. So that's not the entire answer, but I love your question. I love the presentation. What's your favorite foresight tool? One that you love going back to and why? Love futures wheels, of course, and like a good foresight professional and firm, we hack and hack and hack those tools. So if you go to the Activator online, Are you ever joining the Future School Accelerator in person? Our next one live, fingers crossed, is in Austin, Texas this October, and it's already filling up. And just like many other programs, if we get to October and we're not still able to do it live in Austin, we were supposed to just do one in New York next week, but of course it got canceled. And we do it twice a year, every year in the United States, and then a couple of times outside the US. That's going to happen in London this year too in September, fingers crossed. But if you're not able to visit London in September or Austin in October live, we have the Activator online already open, starts in June, and we have mitigation ideas in place to make those programs happen anyway. So you can sign up for them anyway. Love the Futures Wheels tool. We use it many different ways. We do driver's wheels, impact wheels, scenario wheels, values wheels, and that keeps us from really just getting myopic in our general Futures Wheels concept, where if I have a room full of technologists, they're going to just do tech implications. So there's several good ways to stop people from doing that and be more robust. But if you go look, one of my favorite tools is a tool that we created, Qualitative Predictive Analysis. And if you go read the Transformationalist Guide to Saving the Future on Medium, I talk all about that tool, how to use it, gave it away for free. As a matter of fact, if you go to our website, thefutureschool.com, you can go, you'll find it on the website, you can download our guide to the Natural Foresight Framework, 115 pages of how the Natural Foresight Framework works, a lot of the tools that are used inside of it, and you can download it for free right now. Thank you, Joanna, for that question. Let's see. I love this from Nur. Do you think the ontological unpredictability is something new, or are we going back to the future in a way? I definitely believe we could be going back to the future in a way, that's for sure. This question is really, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, saying like, does something come up, say for instance, like apprenticeship, and brick and mortar goes away, you know, and online or virtual actually presses apprenticeship back forward, which we already had a long time ago. And we're like, oh, we got this brand new thing. It's really something old, but reformed for a new age. So that could very much be. But I also think that, and one of the things I wanted to stress today is that ontological, as Salk used to say, evolution brought us to consciousness, and then as consciousness comes about, we become the process of evolution. So that doesn't mean there's no more biological evolution. It just means that now we can intentionally take evolution of our species in our own hands in terms of the Bostrom's or Harari's, you know, post-human ideas and this kinds of things. So it could be the nature of the future is very much changing itself, and it will be something that's not brick and mortar, not apprenticeship and education, something brand new. Let's see. I love that Marguerite says, apparently there cannot be a philosophy of the future. Yeah, I think, you know, semantics a little bit. I think that the future thinking itself is a philosophy, but I do love what you say that it doesn't exist yet. So there's not a philosophy of actually the future itself. It's ever changing. Considering that culture, shared values, beliefs, experiences, behaviors, do you think there could be a culture of the future? Oh man, that's a great question. And I think in a way you've answered it yourself. I absolutely do believe there could be a culture of the future. And I think it fits in perfectly what we talked about today. As a matter of fact, if you go to my blog at thefutureschool.com and look at Holoptic Foresight Dynamics, you'll read all about how I believe this to be a cultural, fostering a cultural evolutionary trait of foresight. So awesome. Here's my good friend, Alex Float. Frank, thanks for introducing me to foresight. Wow, that's cool. You're welcome, sir. How do we approach those who are looking for practical foresight versus aspirational foresight? I don't think there's a difference, by the way, between aspirational foresight and practical foresight, because, and I know what you mean, so I'm not demeaning the question at all, but we all want to see better futures, right? I mean, what's the point? If really we're practicing futures today and it's just like, I'm just totally right in the middle, riding the line, right down the middle, and I don't care if the world gets better or not. I'm a futurist just here to tell you that things are either going to get good or bad, or, you know, first of all, we don't predict. Prediction is bad futuring, because if we predict, we become brittle. We become fragile. We create official futures, straight line futures. And whenever you do that, you become more and more brittle. The more you officially predict, the more brittle you become. Mapping the future is much better than predicting, even if we could predict. And I know that there's books out there, super forecasting and all. Go look and see what the time frame that they actually talked about that they were accurate to is not very far out. So past a little bit of super forecasting, as far out as it could take you, which isn't very far, you're going to still need foresight. You're going to need futures thinking, because again, we catch it. we see those far out futures, 10, 20, 50 years, and we start pulling. And when we do, we not only pull humanity to those futures, we pull the future to today. But you go on and say, thinking especially for smaller organizations who need these skills without extensive resources. Very practical foresight integration training kind of question. How do we get foresight, democratize foresight with the smaller organizations? And there's great ways to do that in terms of just, and I think, Alex, maybe you and I have even talked about this before. You've been in some training with us where we talked about how to integrate and do practical steps in your organization. Not for mine, but maybe if that is listening, I know that could fit into her presentation tomorrow at 4. So I'm going to leave that question for her because I think it fits in perfectly how to actually make this practical and real for organizations. That'll be awesome. Can you tell us more about the connection between futures and design? Yes, I'd love to. As a matter of fact, last year I got the chance to speak at the Industrial Design Conference in Chicago, and I get to speak at a good number of design conferences now because I sort of, I love playing in the field. I'm not a designer. I don't pretend to be a designer, but I have done some brief teaching at Savannah College of Art and Design and actually teaching in their business design courses, how to institute foresight into design. Also created the first future thinking course at the TIP program at Duke University back in 2009. And we did a lot of design in that course as well, and then for other design pieces that I've done. So I do whole presentations on futures and design, and a lot of that's on our website as well too. So if you go to the Future School, I know I'm not saying catchfutures.com. Again, I showed here you can go there. Our blog is on thefutureschool.com because there's a lot of things to talk about there, like certification that we launched this past year. We launched professional certification about a year ago, and people around the world are now receiving credentialing and accreditation in that professional certification that we don't accredit. There is a separate body that accredits that. We only created it and moderate it, so to speak, but it's so exciting. So go there and take a look at that. You'll see a lot about design and futuring. A lot of designers are coming to the Future School now, or to our trainings. Our design teams are even asking Kej to come in and teach them how to do this because they really understand that service design, industrial design, product design, strategic design are all better served when they're forward-looking. Design tends to be a how do we create the future better kind of discipline anyway, or what are we creating? And design needs to be very careful that it's not, as Dun and Raby said, just creating from a system that's already broken and antiquated and outdated. And so designers is a perfect field for them to look at and use foresight. Don't miss Phil Balagtas tomorrow. I think he's at 3 o'clock New York time. He runs Design Futures Initiative and the Primer Conference, and he'll be speaking specifically tomorrow to speculative futures and speculative design and strategic foresight and design. That's a great session, so I won't steal his thunder. Awesome. Is this session that you were recommending? I'm not sure about that session. Pedro, look up Yvette Salvatico. She's on at 4 p.m. New York time tomorrow. Phil Balagtas is at 3 p.m. right before her. And of course, everybody tomorrow is amazing. I'm just pointing out this too. Is there a cost for an activator? Yes, there is. You can look at that up at thefutureschool.com. All the information is there, how to register and apply for the activator. There's already a lot of great people attending the one in June. Thank you, Patty, for that question. Are there other disciplines other than the one that you mentioned, design, that have direct connections and applications with complexity thinking foresight? Absolutely. It's funny, a lot of times, you know, I've done this for 20 years and I've worked in strategy, in innovation, in human development, you know, HR, organizational development, design, of course, and then across industries, everything from transportation to entertainment. I think for those of you who are listening this morning, you got to hear our friend Joanna Lenkova, who is in London right now from Bulgaria, and she talked about the work that they did at the Walt Disney Company, which we helped with as well. So across all kinds of different disciplines. And I really think that this kind of thinking applies to all of them. Here's a little pro tip, I guess. Although I'm sure all of you would have already known this already. You would never go into a client and say, I'm here to talk about complexity and, you know, emergence, and all. They would be like, get out of here. As futurists, we need to make, as Alex said earlier, we need to make that segue, that dip my toe in the water for people around the world. We need to make this accessible. So we can't go to them saying, like, look at all my great foresight knowledge, and beating them over the head. I know I'm talking to people here today who came to a Global Foresight Summit. This is what you came for. If this is not what you came for, I'm sorry that I hit you over the head with it, but I got it. You can see I'm excited about it anyway. We need to make that accessible for them. So I think complexity thinking and foresight applies to all of this, and it's really the way that we approach futures thinking. So if we approach this from a dominant guiding narratives perspective, if we approach foresight only from risk mitigation, only from that quantitative side, and I'm not saying data is, no good at all. It's only a piece of the equation, and not as big of a piece as we think it is oftentimes. It is a piece. It's not the whole piece, and it's not the biggest piece. There's many pieces to this, and that's complexity in itself. So foresight has many, many facets to it. If you practice foresight, as we do at Kedge, complexity is in the background. You know that you're using it. You're presenting frameworks that allow that to breathe and flow, even though your audience doesn't know complexity. So I think it applies to everything. Thank you for that, anonymous attendee. Timothy, I'm from Nigeria, my good friend. Thanks, Frank, for introducing me to foresight. You are welcome. Love you. Yes, yes, and yes. Let's see, Doc Martins, and this will be my last question, and I think I'll turn it back over to our moderators. Doc says, and she's in New York, it's good to see you, Doc, one of my good friends. Given one of my favorite quotes, design makes futures, what designers make becomes the futures we inhabit. That's right. In this, design is unique. Other discourses imagine new and different things, but do not realize them as things that people in the future will experience as their reality. There are practices of making, but these crafts do not imagine new kinds and so future things. Do you think there is an extra responsibility on designers to be great future thinkers? I totally hear what you're saying, Doc, but I don't think there's an extra responsibility. I think, and this is a great place for us to end, thank you for this, because I think we all have a moral and ethical responsibility to democratize the future. Let me just say that one more time. All of us have a moral and ethical responsibility to democratize the future. This is not just a discipline and a practice. This is not something that if your organization does it, it's great. We have an ethical responsibility to do this. Our present crisis should prove that. We have an ethical responsibility to think about the future, not only in ways to mitigate risk and look at our systems that we're presently in, reductively or recursively or reflexively in different ways, but novel ways of thinking about the future. This is why this presentation I gave today, for me, is so dear to my heart and so important, a big part of futures thinking. So I totally hear what Doc is saying, because I think designers, and that's why the foresight design field is like, if you didn't know this, go look. It's merging like crazy. It's so great. I love it. I want to see that happen with strategists, innovators, org developers, governmental, politicians and governmental leaders and premiers and presidents and across the board, because we have an ethical and moral responsibility to the future, not just to the present. And as a matter of fact, remember what I said, the way we all think about the future individually, collectively, directly impacts the actions we take today. So the way we're thinking about the future, the way that we unconsciously even think about the future, directs the actions that we take today. So I'll let that be my last one. Thank you so much for everybody that's joined me today. It was an honor. Thank you for our hosts in Spain who have so graciously allowed me to share today, and all of the other great speakers that came before and for the next 2 days will come after. And I wish the best of luck to everyone. And I look forward to you all visiting me on LinkedIn or on Facebook or on Twitter or at thefutureschool.com or at kedgefutures.com. Thank you, guys.